$8. One little girl, one global superstar. When Charlize Theron picked up the phone to call the president of Burkina Faso, she thought it was just a simple thank you, a polite gesture, a good deed. But in the next 60 minutes, she heard something that would crack open her worldview and force her to question everything she thought she knew about Africa, about justice, and about herself. He didn't greet her with flattery. He didn't tell her what she wanted to hear. He told her the truth, raw, unfiltered, and painfully human. A truth about a little girl named Isata, who died because an $8 medicine never reached her village in time. A truth about good intentions, global systems, and the silent violence of bureaucracy. And before we go further, you should know this story is fictional, but the feelings it awakens are very real. The heartbreak, the power imbalance, the quiet injustice that takes lives not through bullets, but through silence. Those things happen every day. So if you believe stories can be mirrors and questions can be more powerful than answers, keep watching. This isn't just a story about Charlize Theron. It's a story about all of us, about the gap between what we mean to do and what we actually cause. And it all began with one unexpected answer. Los Angeles, 6:12 a.m. The city hadn't quite woken up yet. The sky was still tinted with ash blue haze, and a fine layer of June gloom settled over the hills like a silk blanket. In a quiet kitchen framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, Charlize Theron sat barefoot, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of black coffee. She wasn't in makeup. No stylists, no lights, no glam. Just her and the soft hum of a world slowly stirring to life. She wasn't supposed to be up this early. Jet lag, maybe. Or just that vague restlessness that never quite left. The one that always crept in between film shoots, gala speeches, and charity interviews. The one that whispered, "You're doing good. But is it enough?" She absent-mindedly scrolled through her newsfeed. Headlines whirred past her thumbs like static. Climate crisis displaces 30,000 in coastal West Africa. Foreign aid cuts spark protests in sub-Saharan region. Burkina Faso president visits northern village school. Africa doesn't need saviors. It needs partners. Her thumb stopped. It was that line. Africa doesn't need saviors. It needs partners. She blinked, read it again. The quote felt different, not dramatic, not quotable for the sake of PR. It felt raw, grounded, sharp, but not cynical. She clicked on the article. There wasn't much media coverage, just a local outlet that had translated the president's remarks from a press conference after visiting a remote school in the Sahel region. The piece was filled with grainy photos, a dusty chalkboard, barefoot children with glowing eyes, a young man in military fatigues crouching down to tie a child's broken sandal. No red carpets, no polished sound bites. And that man, President Ibrahim Traoré, didn't look like what the West typically imagined when they heard African president. There was no designer suit, no sweeping entourage, just a leader with dust on his boots, sweat on his collar, and eyes that looked like they had seen too much, and still chose hope anyway. Charlize stared at his photo longer than she meant to. There was something in that expression. Something quiet and steady, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that came not from defeat, but from carrying too much truth and watching too few people care to hear it. She closed the article, and then, without thinking, she opened her secure contacts. She hesitated for a moment. Her thumb hovered above the call button. "What are you doing, Charlize?" she muttered to herself. "It's a Thursday morning. You're in pajamas." But something deeper answered back. Not a voice, but a pull, a tug from somewhere inside her ribs. She pressed call, a quiet beep, then a long international tone. She didn't know what she was expecting. Maybe a voicemail, a secretary, maybe nothing at all. Maybe even hoping it wouldn't go through. But it did. Somewhere on the other side of the world, in a modest office in Ouagadougou, a phone began to ring. Back in LA, Charlize adjusted her posture. She cleared her throat. Her hand trembled just a little. What would she even say? Thank you. I admire your work. I read something you said in the news and it stayed with me. It all sounded hollow. She was used to giving speeches, not having unscripted conversations with presidents of war-torn countries. And yet here she was, heart racing, unsure why the moment felt so much bigger than a phone call had any right to be. And just before the line clicked, before a voice picked up on the other side of the world, she whispered to herself, "You're just calling to say thank you, right?" But deep down, something else knew. This wasn't just a call. It was the start of something much bigger, something she wasn't ready for, something that would make her question everything. And it all began because one line in a small African article refused to let her look away. The late afternoon sun hung low over Ouagadougou, casting long, golden shadows across the city's red clay roads. The capital moved at its own rhythm, neither hurried nor still, a blend of ancient patience and modern urgency. Motorbikes zipped past overloaded market stalls. Barefoot children played soccer in courtyards painted with peeling murals of revolution and resilience. The air shimmered with heat, dust, and something intangible. The quiet weight of history watching from every wall. Inside the modest presidential compound, a battered SUV rolled to a stop beside the shaded steps of the main building. The passenger door opened, and President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out. His boots hit the ground with a heavy thud, coated in the fine orange dust of the northern provinces. His khaki shirt was wrinkled from the long drive. A faint ring of sweat darkened his collar, and his eyes, sharp, steady, held the layered exhaustion of a man who had seen too much suffering and not nearly enough solutions. He had just returned from Gorom Gorom, a village 4 hours north, where he'd spent the day visiting a rural school rebuilt after last year's flash floods. The roof was tin, and the walls were cracked, but the children had sung songs in the local Moray language, their voices rising into the midday heat like birds defying gravity. One girl had handed him a folded piece of paper, a drawing of her holding a book, smiling beneath the Burkina flag. That image was still in his mind as he stepped inside. The presidential office wasn't grand. No velvet curtains, no marble floors, just clean tile, aging wood, and a single portrait of Thomas Sankara hung behind his desk. The silent mentor he still whispered to when no one was listening. He loosened his boots but didn't bother to change. His hands still smelled faintly of diesel and millet. He reached for a file of policy notes on rural teacher retention, but didn't get far. A soft knock tapped against the doorframe. Aminata, his assistant, entered quietly. Young, composed, but with the kind of respectful urgency that always meant something unexpected. "Mr. President," she said, her voice measured, "there's a call on the secure line." He raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "She says her name is Charlize Theron." The name hung in the air for a moment, familiar but out of place. He looked up from his desk, clearly intrigued. "The actress?" he asked, not quite masking his surprise. Aminata nodded. "Yes, sir. She said it's personal, and she sounded emotional." He leaned back in his chair, pausing. The weight of 100 priorities swirled in his head. Defense briefings, food shortages, displaced families in the Sahel. And now Charlize Theron? He had seen her on international panels, heard her name attached to campaigns, watched her accept awards beneath stage lights while speaking about African health and education. Always polished, always sincere, but never personal, never direct. "She didn't say what it was about?" he asked. "No, sir," Aminata replied. "Only that she needed to speak to you, and that it wouldn't take long." He studied her face. Aminata had a good instinct for people. She was young but not naive. If she thought the call mattered, it probably did. Still, something in him hesitated. It wasn't suspicion. More like curiosity wrapped in caution. "Put her through," he said at last. Aminata nodded, turning to leave, but paused at the door. "Sir," she added quietly, "maybe this is not about what she wants to say, but what she needs to hear." He looked at her for a moment, the corner of his mouth twitching into something between a smile and a sigh. "We'll find out." As she left, he straightened his posture and reached for the handset. The secure line pulsed with a soft tone. He let it ring once, twice. Then he picked up. "Hello," he said, his voice calm and composed. the voice he used for foreign dignitaries, military commanders, and disillusioned journalists alike. There was a pause on the other end, a breath, and then came the voice. Unmistakable, fragile, and unexpectedly human. "President Traoré," the woman said, "this is Charlize Theron. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." His brow furrowed slightly, not at her presence, but at her tone. It wasn't the confident, rehearsed voice he'd heard on podiums and in interviews. There was a tremor in it. Not weakness, vulnerability. She hadn't called to impress. She had called because something inside her needed to understand. And he knew, right then, this conversation was going to be different. Very different. Charlize inhaled so quietly she almost forgot to let the breath go. "President Traoré," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to thank you. I read about your visit to that school in the north, about what you told the reporters, how Africa doesn't need saviors, it needs partners. Those words, they moved me." She paused, then rushed on, as if afraid the line might cut. "I've spent years supporting health clinics and education programs across the continent, and sometimes it feels like we're all just patching holes in a dam that keeps cracking. Hearing you speak gave me hope that real change is possible. So thank you for standing up to foreign interference, for fighting corruption, for leading with integrity." Traoré listened without interrupting. He heard earnestness, yes, but also distance, the careful tone of someone speaking from a balcony onto a street they had never walked. Outside his window, the dusty courtyard was falling into the bruised light of early evening. The call carried faint static, like wind sweeping through a broken shutter. When Charlize stopped, the silence felt both respectful and unfinished. He cleared his throat. "Hope is important, Miss Theron," he said, choosing each word slowly. "But may I ask, what kind of Africa are you thanking me for?" The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the fragile cord that linked Los Angeles to Ouagadougou. On her end, Charlize blinked, suddenly aware of the Pacific morning outside her window, the comfort of her kitchen, the gulf of geography and history compressed into one fragile wire. I suppose I'm thanking you for the Africa that deserves better," she offered, "for children who need schools, mothers who need clinics, communities that deserve peace." Traoré nodded, though she could not see it. "Those are worthy goals," he conceded, then let a beat pass long enough to make the air between them tighten. "Yet goals are ideas. Ideas float." He let that sink in before continuing, voice still even. "Here, ideas weigh nothing. Names weigh everything." Charlize felt something in her pulse quicken. "Names. Names," he repeated, "because names tell us whether we speak of people or of symbols." He leaned forward, elbows on the scarred wood of his desk. "Miss Theron, may I ask another question? Do you know the name of a single child in Burkina Faso?" On the other end of the earth, Charlize parted her lips, searching for any syllable that might save her from the truth. None came. The seconds stretched, thin and fragile, until silence itself became the answer. Traoré did not fill the quiet. He let it breathe, let it grow, let it say what polite words could not. Somewhere in Los Angeles, a coffee mug cooled beside an untouched laptop. Somewhere in Ouagadougou, the last daylight slid off a portrait of Sankara. Across that widening hush, two lives, one glittering, one dust-stained, waited, poised at the brink of a conversation that would change them both. And still the silence held. Traoré exhaled slowly. "Let me tell you about someone," he said, his voice softer now, almost careful. "Her name was Isata." The name hovered in the space between them, like something sacred. She was 8 years old. She lived in a village called Gorom Gorom, up near the edge of the Sahel, where the dust never really settles, and the sun doesn't ask for permission to burn. It's not the kind of place that shows up on maps, not unless you zoom in far enough to see the cracks. Charlize didn't speak. She didn't even breathe too loudly, as if the slightest sound might interrupt the memory. She was small for her age, Traoré continued. Thin, like most children up there, but always moving, always smiling. Her laugh was the kind that surprised you, loud, bright, like she'd stolen it from a child twice her size. She walked barefoot, like many do, and the soles of her feet were tough as leather. But her favorite thing in the world wasn't running or singing or climbing trees like the other kids. It was numbers. A brief chuckle slipped into his voice. Nostalgic, proud, a little broken. Yes, numbers. Isata loved math. Multiplication tables were like magic spells to her. She'd recite them like songs, tapping her fingers in the dirt to keep rhythm. Most kids in her village didn't care much for school. They went because they had to, or because it gave them something to do besides chores. But Isata? She went because she believed school was her way out, not just for herself, but for others. He paused, letting the silence settle around her name again, as if it needed space to live. She wanted to be a teacher, he said. That was her dream, not to leave the village, not to become rich, just to stay and teach the other children how to count, how to read, how to see something more than what the horizon gave them. She once told her mother she wanted to be the reason no one else would have to guess prices at the market. Charlize smiled involuntarily, but the weight behind the smile made it feel heavy. Traoré shifted slightly in his chair, the creak of the old wood audible over the line. Her school was built with international funds, mud bricks, a tin roof, no electricity, just 2 classrooms for more than 60 students. The chalk they used was broken into nubs, shared between 3 hands at a time. The desks were uneven. The floor was dirt. But Isata never complained, not once. Charlize pictured it, the brown walls, the scattered sandals. The sounds of laughter and dust and learning mingled in the same small space. It wasn't a world she had ever walked in, but suddenly it didn't feel so far. She woke up before dawn, he went on, to help her mother draw water from the well, nearly a kilometer away. Then she swept the courtyard, sometimes tended the goats. After that, she walked 6 kilometers to school, and she did it all with a kind of joy that most of us forget we ever had. Another pause. Longer this time, like the memory had touched something raw. You see, Miss Theron, Traoré said, his voice quiet but unwavering. It's easy to talk about numbers. Thousands of children without access to education, millions in poverty, percentages and ratios in aid targets. But numbers are easy to forget. Names are not, especially when you knew the child, especially when she looked up at you with eyes that believed you could make things better. Charlize felt the burn rise behind her eyes. Something in her tightened. This wasn't a story. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a little girl who loved math. She was not a statistic, he said. She was someone. She had favorite colors, yellow and green. She hated beans. She could spell her name in French and in her native Fulfulde, and she believed, really believed, that she could help change her village. All she needed was time. He stopped, letting that final word echo. Time. Charlize pressed the phone closer to her ear. What happened to her? She asked softly. Traoré didn't answer right away, but when he did, the warmth was gone from his voice. She got sick. She got sick, Traoré repeated. His voice was still calm, but something inside it had stiffened, like a door quietly closing behind the warmth of memory. It started with a cough, nothing unusual. Dust is constant in Garam Garam. So is the dry heat. Children cough. It's part of the air. Charlize leaned forward unconsciously, like being closer to the receiver might somehow soften what she was about to hear. She stayed home from school for a day, then 2. Her mother, Mariam, tried herbal remedies at first. Tea made from neem leaves, steam from crushed eucalyptus. Remedies passed down for generations. But the cough deepened. Her breathing grew tight, wheezy. One morning she couldn't finish her sentence without gasping. Mariam picked her up and walked her to the clinic. He paused for a beat, as if picturing the journey. The clinic was small, 1 building, 3 rooms, and a single nurse who covered 12 villages. Supplies were always thin, but they'd managed. For years, they had received regular shipments from a European aid organization. Basic medications, including pediatric antibiotics. Charlize could hear the shift now, the tone that came when a story moved from heartbreak to indictment. That month, the shipment didn't come. She closed her eyes. The medicine she needed, amoxicillin, cost less than $8. It's a first-line treatment, nothing complicated, no cold chain storage, but it had been held back in Rotterdam. There were new donor country regulations requiring updated compliance paperwork, import clearance, distribution certifications, new labeling to match revised EU policy standards. His voice remained measured, almost clinical, but that restraint only made the story land harder. For 3 weeks, the crate sat in a warehouse, he continued, because someone in Brussels or Berlin or Paris hadn't signed a form. Charlize's breath hitched. Mariam waited at the clinic. The nurse told her the medicine was on the way, that it was just delayed, that maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day. But there was no next day, she whispered. No, he said. There wasn't. He looked out the window as he spoke, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the compound courtyard. She died on a Tuesday morning, around 6:45 a.m., the nurse told me. Mariam called my office that same afternoon, not to complain, not to demand anything. She said, I know you cannot bring her back. I just wanted someone to know that she existed. Charlize pressed a hand to her mouth. It felt like something inside her was cracking open, not in a dramatic, theatrical way, but in the quiet way grief enters through a door you didn't even realize was unlocked. She didn't call to place blame, Traoré said. She called because she wanted her daughter's life and her death to be witnessed. Silence fell again, thick and deliberate, but this time it wasn't empty. It carried the weight of systems, intentions, delays, and consequences, of labels printed in the wrong language, of customs officers with no urgency, of warehouse managers with clean floors and locked doors. Miss Theron, he said, you support an organization that helps fund that aid group. You've spoken at their events. You've been on stage in Geneva, New York, London. You've helped raise millions. She started but stopped. The defense caught in her throat. She didn't want to speak. She wanted to rewind. I'm not blaming you, he said gently but firmly. This isn't about blame. It's about the price of bureaucracy. The cost of systems designed to serve donors more than recipients. The cost of doing everything right, on paper, and still letting a child die. Charlize felt heat rise behind her eyes, not the performative tears cameras might catch. These were slow, personal, private, the kind of tears that come when truth strips you of all the stories you told yourself to feel better. What was the name of the organization? She asked quietly. He hesitated, then said, It doesn't matter. They do good work, on the whole, but they, like many others, are trapped in a system where process is king, where policy outranks people, where documentation matters more than a pulse. She said nothing, because there was nothing she could say. And as the weight of that truth settled between them, it became terrifyingly clear that this was not a story about what went wrong once. This was a story about what keeps going wrong, quietly all the time. Traoré let the silence linger, not as punishment, but as space for the weight of what he had said to settle in fully. On the other end, Charlize didn't try to fill it. She couldn't. Her breath came unsteady now, barely audible through the line, but unmistakably trembling. One hand was pressed against her lips, the other clenched at her side. The tears that slid down her cheek weren't loud, weren't dramatic, and they weren't for the cameras. They were the kind that came when the illusion of control had finally, irreversibly slipped away. She had spent years talking about Africa, on panels, in interviews, at glittering galas, confident in her convictions, rehearsed in her righteousness, but now confronted not with a statistic or a cause, but with the story of a single child who had died not from violence or poverty, but from a delay in paperwork. Something inside her broke. She didn't ask for anything, Traoré continued, his voice low, steady, almost distant. Not a favor, not a refund, not justice. When Mariam called my office, she didn't raise her voice. She wasn't angry. She said, I know my daughter cannot be brought back. I know you are busy. I only want someone in authority to know that she existed. He paused, not for effect, but because even now retelling it still demanded breath. She wanted her daughter's name to live somewhere other than in her own mouth. Charlize's tears fell more freely now. She didn't try to wipe them away. Her body leaned forward as if to apologize to a world that had never asked for her guilt, but had always borne its weight. Traoré heard her, but he didn't comfort her. He didn't offer soft words to smooth the sharp edge of what had been said, because this wasn't a story designed to soothe. This isn't about guilt, he said, gently but with clarity. It's about truth. He let those 4 words stand, solid, unmoving. Guilt centers you, he continued after a moment. Truth centers the people we've ignored. Charlize drew a breath through her nose, sharp and shaky. She realized she had been holding her body still for several minutes, like bracing against a storm she didn't quite understand. What happened to Miriam? She asked quietly. She's still there, he replied. Still in Goram Goram, still drawing water, still waking before dawn. She's become a kind of informal health advocate in her village now, trying to make sure no one else loses a child the way she did. Not because anyone asked her to, not because she got a grant, just because grief, when it has nowhere to go, either crushes you or moves you. Charlize nodded, though he couldn't see her. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She's not looking for charity, Traoré added. She's looking for partnership, for someone who will listen without assuming, someone who sees her not as a victim, but as a leader. And then for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because sometimes truth doesn't need a reply. The silence that followed Miriam's story was not empty. It was full of grief, of shame, of unspoken reckoning. On the other end of the line, Charlize remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of someone finally beginning to hear what had always been there. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but softer, stripped of performance. I've spent years speaking about Africa, she said, each word measured, as if carefully unpacking a suitcase she hadn't realized was overstuffed. On stages, in interviews, in award shows and campaign ads. I've written op-eds, given quotes, flown in, flown out. I've used words like hope and empowerment and impact, and never once stopped to ask myself, who was actually writing the story? She paused. The admission was uncomfortable, not because it was false, but because it was finally true. I've spoken about Africa, she continued quietly, without ever listening to Africa. Traoré didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried something unexpected. Warmth, not condemnation. That's not uncommon, he said. The rare thing is realizing it. Charlize let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Traoré leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the fading horizon. There is a kind of storytelling, he said, that allows people to feel like heroes without having to understand what they're saving. Charlize nodded slowly, her mind sifting through years of memories, photos taken beside smiling children in villages she couldn't name, benefit dinners where she spoke about change while sipping champagne flown in from Europe, meetings with NGO leaders who never once asked the communities they claimed to serve what they actually needed. We're taught, she said, that doing something is always better than doing nothing, that if we have a platform, we're supposed to use it. But maybe I used it more for myself than for anyone else. Traoré didn't disagree. He didn't need to. Intentions matter, he said, but they are not enough. Intentions without understanding can be dangerous, sometimes fatal. He let that hang for a moment, not as an accusation, but as a truth too long avoided. Let me ask you something, he continued. How many galas have you attended where a child's face was projected onto a big screen, their name simplified, their story reduced to a sentence designed to pull a checkbook from someone's pocket? Charlize winced. She didn't need to answer. And how many of those events followed up? He asked. How many sent reports back to the village? How many asked the mother of that child if her story could be told that way, on that stage, in that language? Her throat tightened. She had no defense, only the echo of applause in ballrooms far from where those children had ever walked. There's a system, Traoré said, that rewards performance, that elevates visibility over accountability, that values glossy brochures more than functioning clinics. It's not just you, it's the entire machinery. Charlize stared out her window. Morning light had filled her kitchen now, golden and calm. But inside her, something restless stirred. She remembered the interviews where she'd said all the right things, worn the branded pin, smiled beside children whose names she forgot before boarding her flight home. At the time, it had felt meaningful. Now it felt hollow. "What should I have done differently?" she asked, not defensively, but honestly. Traoré was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, "You should have asked better questions. You should have listened before you spoke. You should have remembered that solidarity is not a photo opportunity. It's a posture." Charlize swallowed hard. "It's not wrong to care," he added, "but it is dangerous to care loudly without first caring deeply." She closed her eyes. Let those words land. This wasn't guilt. This was something deeper, something heavier, something truer, and it felt necessary. Charlize sat in silence for several long seconds, absorbing the weight of what had just been said. Her breath had settled. Her tears had dried. But something inside her had shifted, like a gear clicking into place. She no longer felt the impulse to defend, to explain, or even to apologize. That impulse had been replaced by something deeper, something rarer. Curiosity, the real kind, the kind that came not from wanting to respond, but from wanting to understand. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Of course," Traoré replied, his tone unchanged, measured, open, but never performative. "What does education really look like there?" she asked. "Not the kind we show in campaign videos or donor reports. I mean, what are children actually learning?" Traoré leaned back, letting the question land properly. "That depends on the village, the region, the language spoken at home, and whether the teacher even shows up. But more than anything, it depends on which language the state insists the child learn in." Charlize tilted her head. "Language? Yes," he said. "Most schools here teach in French. It's the colonial legacy. But most children grow up speaking Moray, Fulfulde, Dioula, any number of indigenous languages. So imagine this. A 6-year-old walks into her first classroom. She's told to read, write, and speak in a language she has never heard at home, while also being judged on her ability to absorb a curriculum designed in Paris." Charlize went still. "So they're being taught to read in a language they don't speak?" "Exactly," he said, "which means they're not really learning to read. They're memorizing symbols, and we call that literacy." She was quiet again. Then, "Why not just teach them in their own language?" "We're trying," he replied. "There are pilot programs, community-led efforts, but the funding prefers French. International donors want measurable results in standardized formats. That means test scores. That means French." Charlize frowned. "So the funding shapes the language, and the language shapes who's allowed to succeed." "Yes," Traoré said simply. "Language isn't neutral. It decides who gets to dream in color and who must survive in translation." Charlize exhaled. "That's not something I've ever considered." "That's the point," he said. There was a long pause. Then another question. "What about women's rights?" she asked, this time more hesitantly. "It's something I've spoken about a lot, but I realize now, I don't know how it really plays out on the ground." Traoré answered without judgment. "Women's rights look different in each village, each family. In some places, women lead entire farming cooperatives. In others, they still need a husband's signature to open a bank account. And sometimes both things happen in the same town. So progress isn't linear. Progress is never linear," he said, "especially when the outside world insists on measuring it by how closely it resembles their own structures." Charlize stared at the floor, brow furrowed. "We're always looking for the story that fits the narrative we've already decided on." "Yes," he said, "because it's easier to tell a clean story than to live a complicated truth." She looked up again, her voice steadier now. "How do you navigate all that? The politics, the culture, the pressure from abroad?" His reply was simple. "I listen to the people who have the least." There was something devastating about how obvious it was, and how rarely that principle seemed to guide global leadership. Charlize leaned back in her chair, mind racing, heart open. "I think," she said slowly, "for years I've been answering questions I never should have been answering. Because I never thought to ask them in the first place. That, Traoré said gently, is the beginning of wisdom. The call had stretched far longer than either of them expected. The morning light in Los Angeles had matured into midday, casting soft shadows across Charlize's kitchen, the hum of traffic in the distance now completely forgotten. On the other side of the world, Ouagadougou was bathed in late afternoon gold. Time zones had faded, and for the past hour, so had borders, roles, and titles. It wasn't a celebrity talking to a president anymore. It was just two people, peeling back layers of misunderstanding, one uncomfortable truth at a time. Charlize rested her hand on the kitchen counter, fingertips tracing the grain of the wood as she struggled to find words that didn't feel hollow. I don't want to be that person anymore, she said finally, her voice low but sure. The one who speaks before listening, who assumes, who tells stories without asking who they belong to. Traoré didn't speak, allowing her the space to complete the thought. I've spent so much time trying to lead, she continued, trying to inspire others to act. But maybe the most powerful thing I can do right now is stop performing and start learning. Her voice cracked slightly. I can't undo what I've already said, but I can choose how I show up next. There was a pause, not filled with regret, but with a fragile new clarity. I want to learn, she said. Not lead, not speak for, not fix. Just learn. Traoré nodded silently on his end of the line, though she couldn't see it. His face softened, but he didn't rush to validate her. He knew that real transformation didn't need applause. It needed commitment. I hope you will, he said simply. And if you do, you'll find many here who are ready to teach. There was a long, quiet breath shared between them, half a world apart, but now deeply connected by something rare. Honesty without ego. Thank you for listening, she said. Thank you for calling, he replied. When the line finally went silent, Charlize didn't move right away. She stood still, surrounded by the ordinary comfort of her Los Angeles home. Sunlight on white walls, the faint scent of coffee, the familiar hush of privilege. But inside her, something was different. The room hadn't changed, but she had. Not completely. Not in some dramatic, cinematic way, but in the way that truly mattered. Across the ocean, Traoré placed the handset gently back into its cradle. Outside, the sun dipped lower over Ouagadougou, painting the horizon in copper and red. The dust in the air turned the light into a hazy glow that made everything look softer, older. He remained seated for a moment, elbows on his desk, eyes fixed on the sky. The silence of his office, usually a sanctuary after long days of weighty decisions, felt unusually reflective now. That, he muttered to himself with the faintest smile, was unexpected. A beat passed, but necessary. He rose, walked to the window, and watched as children played in the courtyard below the palace walls. Kicking a worn ball, laughter echoing upward, the world turning without pause. There were no cameras, no speeches, just life, as it was, as it is. And somewhere in the air between two continents, a quiet revolution had begun. 3 months later, just before dawn, a small twin-prop plane skirted across the pale horizon of Burkina Faso and descended onto the tarmac of Ouagadougou International Airport. There was no press line, no flash of paparazzi bulbs, no velvet-roped welcome committee. The only witness to Charlize Theron's arrival was the warm, rust-colored wind that rolled through the open cabin door the moment it clicked ajar. She stepped onto the stairs in loose khaki trousers, a linen shirt, and a simple canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. No entourage, no designer luggage, nothing that hinted at Hollywood. If any passerby recognized her, they gave no sign. Perhaps the still sleepy airport staff mistook her for a field researcher or a teacher arriving for a new post. Either way, anonymity suited her. An NGO driver, recommended quietly by Traoré's office under strict instructions to keep the trip discreet, waited beside an aging Land Cruiser. He greeted her with a polite nod and a soft bonsoir, though it was just past sunrise. On the drive into the capital, Charlize stared out the window, watching the city unfurl in slow motion. Women balancing baskets of mangoes on their heads, men pedaling rusty bicycles stacked with firewood, children in faded uniforms waving at the morning traffic. The city felt both alive and unhurried, every movement etched against the ochre glow of first light. They didn't head to a hotel. Instead, the driver maneuvered through side streets until they reached a narrow lane of single-story cement block houses. He stopped at a modest guest house painted sea green, bougainvillea creeping over its low wall. Inside, a kindly matron named Adele showed Charlize to a small room with a single fan and a mosquito net draped neatly over a wooden bed frame. The air smelled faintly of hibiscus tea and chalk dust. When Charlize dropped her backpack to the floor, she felt a surprising sense of calm, like exhaling after holding her breath for years. She spent the first days simply walking, no security details shadowing her steps, no production crew documenting the journey. She wandered through open-air markets, fingers brushing the rough skins of yams and the smooth shells of groundnuts. She practiced greetings in Moray, ne i windiga, and laughed at her own accent. She learned to bargain for grilled plantains and to read the subtle choreography of street vendors who navigated barter with a fluid grace that felt like dance. On the fourth morning, she rose before dawn to join Adele in the courtyard for breakfast. Millet porridge sweetened with honey and spiced with a hint of ginger. Adele corrected her pronunciation patiently and offered stories about her childhood in Bobo Dioulasso. Charlize listened more than she spoke, taking mental notes on every detail: how the taste of water changed with the seasons, why women wrapped their pagnis a certain way for funerals versus weddings, the meaning hidden in the different patterns of kente cloth. Each new fact felt like another layer stripped from the simplistic narrative she had once carried. Midweek, she accepted an invitation to visit a primary school on the outskirts of the city. There were no journalists waiting by the gate, only the squeal of chalk on slate and the rustle of small feet scurrying to their benches. The head teacher, a wiry man named Monsieur Diallo, welcomed her with a handshake and offered a desk at the back of a classroom. Charlize sat quietly, notebook in hand, while 30 children sang multiplication tables in unison, switching seamlessly between French and Moray. She noted how the teacher paused after each French sentence to translate, how some pupils' shoulders lifted with confidence when addressed in their mother tongue, how others grew restless when forced back into the foreign cadence of colonial syllables. During recess, 2 girls shyly approached and asked her name. She answered, then asked theirs. Awa and Fati. They giggled at her accent, then pulled her by the hand to see the tiny library, a single shelf of dog-eared books, some missing covers, others held together with tape. Awa's favorite was a weather-beaten math primer. Because numbers don't change, she said in halting French. Charlize felt a pang. Isata flashed in her memory, her bright smile and love of arithmetic. She swallowed hard, meeting Awa's eyes with a grateful nod. That afternoon, she helped serve lunch, rice and sauce feuille, to students who ate with quiet concentration, their metal bowls clinking softly. No one treated her like a star. She was just another pair of hands, and that was what she wanted. When the final bell rang, she stayed behind, sweeping dust from the floor alongside the janitor, learning the rhythm of his broom, the cadence of his stories about growing up in the North. Walking back to the guest house in the amber dusk, Charlize realized she hadn't taken a single selfie, hadn't updated any social feed, hadn't felt the twitch to document any moment for public validation. Everything she carried that evening, dust on her shoes, new words on her tongue, the shy confidence in Awa's voice, was meant for memory, not publicity. Somewhere inside, a quiet revolution was gaining momentum, and nobody on the outside even knew it had begun. The road to Gorum Gorum stretched into a heat-blurred horizon, flanked by acacia trees and stretches of cracked earth that shimmered under the weight of the midday sun. Charlize sat in the back of the four-wheel drive, her palms pressed together in her lap, fingers unconsciously twisting. This journey was unlike anything she had done before. There was no red carpet at the end, no curated itinerary. It was simply a meeting between 2 women, one grieving, one learning, both changed by the same small voice. The vehicle slowed as they approached the village. A handful of children paused their game of tag in the dusty yard to stare curiously, some breaking into shy smiles. A painted school wall came into view, and with it, the mural, the one she had heard about, the one that had lived in her imagination for weeks. It was more beautiful than she expected. There, in vivid reds and blues, was a little girl with a bright, beaming face. Her eyes sparkled with a joy that transcended paint. Around her floated chalkboard equations, stacks of books, and golden stars. Beneath her feet, in Moray and French, the words, "Don't cry for our children. Stand where they stood. Learn what they learned. Then speak." Charlize stood before it in silence, breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward slowly, drawn to the wall like it was a heartbeat. Her fingertips hovered just above the painted smile, frozen in time, defying tragedy. "You came," said a voice behind her. Charlize turned. Miriam was dressed in a simple blue boo-boo, her headscarf neatly wrapped, eyes clear and calm. She looked older than the photos, but not in a way that made her appear frail, rather like someone who had lived through fire and emerged sharper, more focused. She approached without hesitation, her steps neither slow nor rushed. Charlize opened her mouth, unsure what to say. Everything she had rehearsed on the ride felt suddenly hollow, but Miriam reached out and gently took her hand. "You're welcome here," she said, her voice low and even. "Not as someone famous, not as someone to be thanked, but as a mother, as a listener, as someone willing to sit and stay." Charlize nodded, tears stinging her eyes again. "Thank you for having me." Mariam led her to a low bench beneath the shade of a neem tree beside the school. They sat side by side, the mural behind them, the sun beginning its long descent toward evening. The air smelled of earth and distant wood smoke. Children's laughter echoed faintly from across the schoolyard. They spoke quietly at first, about the school, about the village, about how the mural had come to be. Miriam told her that it was painted by young artists who had once been students alongside Isata. One of them had remembered the exact shape of her handwriting. Another had drawn the stars because she always said she wanted to shine in the sky, not just on earth. Charlize listened with her whole body. Every detail felt like a stone placed gently in her hand. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry for what happened to her, and for how long it took me to see her, not as a symbol, but as your daughter, as a real child, with dreams, with joy." Miriam's gaze didn't waver. "She wasn't just mine. She belonged to this place, to her classmates, to the girls she helped walk to school. She was full of light." They sat in a silence that wasn't heavy, but sacred. "You cry," Miriam said softly, "but don't cry only for her." Charlize looked at her, confused. Miriam reached out and placed a hand on her arm. "Cry for what you've seen. Cry for what you've learned. But after that, carry her voice forward. That's what she would have wanted. Not sadness. Purpose." Charlize nodded, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. "I will," she whispered. "I promise." Miriam smiled gently, and for the first time, there was no pain behind it, only memory and grace. "Then we are not so different, you and I. We both lost something, and we both have something left to give." As the sun slipped lower, casting long, golden shadows over the schoolyard, two women sat side by side, no longer strangers, no longer separated by continents or class, just two women bound by the story of a little girl who had changed both their lives forever. And behind them, Isata smiled on. The road to the clinic was quieter than Charlize expected. No horns, no bustling street vendors, only the rhythmic hum of tires over hard-packed dirt and the distant bleating of goats. She sat in the back seat of the old pickup, journal on her lap, eyes trained on the horizon. There was no camera crew, no speech to deliver, no waiting crowd. Just her, the driver, and a silent promise. Today she would say less and hear more. The clinic sat at the edge of the village, its concrete walls recently repainted a soft clay red that blended with the soil beneath. A tin roof shimmered under the midday sun, and a large mango tree shaded the entrance. It looked humble but functional, alive. As she stepped out of the truck, the air carried the soft murmur of voices, patients waiting quietly, children clutching their mother's wraps, a nurse directing someone gently with a clipboard in hand. Charlize moved slowly, respectfully, notebook tucked under her arm. She had no intention of interrupting. Inside, the air was cooler, fans spinning lazily. A doctor in his early 30s greeted her with a curious glance. He had been told only that a foreign donor was visiting. When he realized who she was, his eyes widened, but Charlize quickly raised a hand in a quiet gesture. No introductions, no applause. She simply nodded and followed him down a hallway that smelled faintly of antiseptic and shea butter. The doctor, Dr. Konate, walked her through the space. A triage area, 2 treatment rooms, a small pharmacy. He spoke in a measured voice, not rehearsed, not embellished. Just facts. 3 months ago, we began receiving supplies consistently again. Not just medicine, but gloves, clean syringes, rapid test kits. He stopped beside a cabinet and opened it gently. Inside, rows of antibiotics, labeled and organized, glinted like gold. Charlize said nothing. She only nodded and wrote. In the waiting room, a young mother cradled a baby with a loose cough. A nurse leaned down, gently checking the infant's breathing, humming a lullaby in Moray. Charlize knelt nearby, not to intervene, but to observe. The nurse looked up, smiled briefly, then returned to her work. In that moment, Charlize felt something shift. This wasn't a photo op. It was a window into how quiet support, real support, meant stepping back and letting others lead. She followed Dr. Konate into a storage room where boxes bore unfamiliar labels. These came from a local NGO, he said. We didn't know who the funding came from at first. Then someone whispered it was you. He smiled, not the reverent kind, but one of shared understanding. Whoever gave it didn't ask for credit. They just wanted the shelves full. Charlize didn't respond. She just looked at the shelves, then back to him, then wrote, "It's not about who helps, it's about who it helps." As she left the clinic, a young boy in uniform ran past her, laughing, chasing a paper kite. Life here was far from perfect, but it was moving, healing, breathing. And for once, she didn't feel the need to narrate it. She just walked on, notebook in hand, and kept listening. The plane ride home from Burkina Faso was long, quiet, and sleepless. Charlize stared out the window at the clouds as they drifted across the Atlantic. But she wasn't thinking about the sky. Her mind was still in Garam Garam, on the mural, on Miriam's steady eyes, on the clinic where medicine finally reached shelves, not in a box labeled emergency, but as part of a rhythm that honored consistency over spectacle. By the time she landed in Los Angeles, she knew something had to change, not just in her speeches or public appearances, but in the entire architecture of her advocacy. And she started with the most powerful lever she had, her money. Over the next few weeks, Charlize quietly requested audits of every organization she had supported in the past 5 years. She asked questions she had never thought to ask before. Who leads this organization? Are they from the communities they serve? Do local staff make decisions or simply implement directives from abroad? How much of each dollar funds programs and how much fuels optics? The results unsettled her. Several of the largest NGOs she had endorsed, some with glossy branding and major celebrity galas, had field offices in Africa but were run entirely from boardrooms in London, New York, or Geneva. Local partners, when they existed, were often subcontracted, underpaid, or sidelined in decision-making. Stories were gathered, repackaged, and broadcast to Western donors, stripped of context but rich in emotion. She remembered something Traoré had said. The system is designed to make you feel good about helping without understanding what help means. Charlize began making phone calls, not to the heads of international nonprofits, but to small grassroots leaders she had met during her trip. Community health workers in Mali, a youth educator in Dakar, a collective of female filmmakers in Nairobi who were documenting women's stories in indigenous languages. Their voices were firm, focused, and deeply knowledgeable, and, until now, invisible. She shut down her foundation's partnerships with 3 major global charities, redirecting funds into a new initiative she called the Listening Fund. Its premise was simple: no press releases, no celebrity ambassadors, no hero language, just money, sent with trust, not strings. She called Miriam personally to let her know. "We're not looking for saviors," Miriam replied gently, "but we welcome allies who walk beside us." In Johannesburg, Charlize met with a theater troupe producing plays on gender violence in township schools. She didn't ask them to perform for donors. She sat in the back row and watched in silence, then funded their next two productions anonymously. In Ghana, she connected with a young woman running coding workshops for girls in rural areas. Instead of offering to amplify her work, Charlize asked, "What do you need that no one is asking about?" The woman laughed softly. "Honestly, laptops that work and internet that doesn't cut out during class." That week, Charlize bought 15 refurbished laptops and worked with a local provider to upgrade their satellite connection. No press, no hashtags, no quote cards, just tools and trust. In Kenya, she was introduced to a filmmaker named Wanjiru, who was working on a documentary about land rights. Wanjiru had applied to several international funds and been told her story was too localized for Western audiences. Charlize asked to see the rough cut. What she watched left her stunned, raw, beautiful, complex. It was the kind of story that didn't need to be simplified. It needed to be seen. She financed the final production under one condition. "You tell it your way. I won't touch the script. Just tell me how I can help you finish it." When the documentary premiered in Nairobi, Charlize sat in the audience like everyone else. Wanjiru's thank you during the credits was brief and unsentimental. "To those who funded with faith." More and more, Charlize stopped being the face and started becoming the backbone. Quiet, strong, and largely unseen. She began saying no to magazine profiles that wanted to center her voice in African causes. She said no to speaking engagements unless they included African thought leaders alongside her, or preferably instead of her. When asked if she was walking away from advocacy, she answered simply, "No. I'm walking differently." And slowly the world noticed, not through a viral headline, not through another televised gala, but in the shift of where the spotlight landed. And for once, it wasn't on her. The auditorium in Geneva was grand. Vaulted ceilings, polished wood paneling, and rows upon rows of white linen seats filled with diplomats, donors, development executives, and journalists. The air buzzed with anticipation as speakers from around the world took the stage, one after another, delivering data-driven insights and polished pitches about aid, infrastructure, and innovation. Charlize had attended events like this for years. She had spoken here before, once in heels so high she couldn't feel her feet, armed with a speech prepared by advisors who knew exactly which emotional chords to strike. But today was different. She arrived quietly without an entourage, in a simple navy dress and flats, carrying nothing but a folded sheet of paper in her hand. When her name was announced, there was a polite flurry of applause. People leaned forward, expecting glamour, perhaps a well-rehearsed appeal for generosity. Instead, Charlize stepped up to the microphone, cleared her throat, and spoke with the calm weight of someone who no longer needed to be heard, only understood. "I used to help," she began. "Now, I learn." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. She let it linger, not to dramatize, but to invite presence. "I came into this work wanting to make a difference. I raised money. I spoke at galas. I flew to places I couldn't pronounce and promised things I didn't fully understand. I believed my passion was enough." She looked down at the paper once, then folded it and placed it on the podium. She wouldn't need it. 3 months ago, I spoke with President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. I called him to say thank you for his leadership, for the work he's doing. I expected to offer praise. Instead, he told me the story of a girl named Isata. The room shifted. Some scribbled notes, others simply listened. Isata was 8 years old. She lived in a village called Gorom Gorom. She loved math. She wanted to be a teacher. One day she got sick, a simple cough, treatable with antibiotics that cost less than $5. But the medicine never arrived. It sat in a warehouse in Europe, delayed by new donor regulations, approval committees, compliance forms. Charlize's voice didn't waver, but her eyes glistened. Isata died waiting. She paused, letting the name settle into the room. Not just as a symbol, but as a girl. Her mother, Miriam, didn't call the clinic. She didn't write to an aid organization. She called the president, not to ask for anything, but to make sure someone knew her daughter had existed. Charlize let the next words fall slowly. Behind every statistic is a name, a face, a daughter. The crowd was silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence. I'm not here today to tell you how to give better. I'm here to ask, are we listening? Are we willing to be wrong? Are we ready to support, not direct? She drew in a breath. Africa does not need to be saved. It needs to be respected, to be partnered with, to be heard. Then softly, I no longer want to stand on stages talking about African problems. I want to sit at tables where Africans lead the conversation. When she finished, she stepped back. There was no dramatic flair, no flourish, just presence. For a heartbeat, the room remained utterly still. Then slowly, without clapping for celebrity, but rising for truth, people stood. Not all at once, not for show, but one by one. A quiet, reverent standing ovation. The kind reserved not for performers, but for witnesses. The days following the Geneva conference were strangely quiet. No explosive headlines, no viral clips, no trending hashtags. And Charlize was glad for it. She had not spoken to be celebrated. She had spoken to be honest. But the silence wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that comes before something shifts underground, before roots take hold beneath the surface. Within a week, the first message arrived. It was a handwritten note delivered to her foundation's mailbox from a health worker in Senegal. Thank you for saying what many of us don't have the microphones to say. We don't want saviors. We want solidarity. Then came an email from a youth activist in Uganda who had watched a recording of her speech on a WhatsApp group. For the first time, I saw someone give up space rather than take it. That gave me courage to ask for more space in my own community. And then, something even more unexpected, phone calls from fellow celebrities. Some were hesitant, others defensive, but a few were curious, even brave. One well-known actress asked Charlize over coffee, "So, how do you actually know if your help is helping?" Charlize smiled and said, "You don't, until you let someone else define what help means." Within months, ripples turned to gentle waves. A handful of celebrities who had once built brands around humanitarianism began revisiting their partnerships. One publicly declined an award for global advocacy, stating, "I don't want to be honored for work I haven't fully understood." More importantly, the shift began inside the organizations themselves. A mid-sized NGO working in Sierra Leone launched its first-ever community-led advisory board. Instead of flying in consultants, they held a town hall in a village square. Plastic chairs under a mango tree, asking local teachers and midwives what programs they actually needed. A large international charity, previously known for glossy campaigns and child sponsorships, quietly suspended their newest marketing drive. In a press release, they cited the need for a structural reassessment of storytelling ethics and recipient agency. For the first time, donors began asking harder questions. Not how many children were reached, but who decided which children needed reaching and how? At Charlize's foundation, grants were restructured. Instead of annual reports filled with numbers and infographics, partner organizations were invited to send reflections, stories, letters, even voice notes. What mattered now wasn't how many people were helped, but how many were heard. She watched as filmmakers she had supported were invited to festivals, not as subjects of impact documentaries, but as directors of their own narratives. One young filmmaker from Côte d'Ivoire opened her short film with a single line. "This story is not told for you. It is told for us, but you're welcome to listen." The impact wasn't loud. It wasn't headline-worthy, but it was real. In communities across Africa, the language of partnership began replacing the language of pity. Local leaders felt a subtle shift, like a weight had been moved just slightly off their shoulders. Charlize didn't post any of it. She didn't mention the ripple effect in interviews. She continued working, mostly behind the scenes, listening, funding, asking better questions. And sometimes late at night she thought about Isata, about how one girl's silence had become a catalyst, not for noise, but for change. It had been nearly 3 years since that first call, the one that had started with a thank you and ended with a vow. Charlize was in Geneva again, preparing to attend a quiet roundtable on development accountability, when the message came. It was from Miriam. The subject line was brief: cholera in Garam Garam. Charlize's heart clenched. She opened the email immediately. The message was short, but every line pulsed with urgency. Outbreak reported in nearby villages. Confirmed cases this morning. But don't worry, we were ready. Network is active. Supplies are in place. Local volunteers already moving. We'll update. There was no panic in Miriam's words. No pleas for help. No desperation. Only calm, swift coordination. A stark contrast to the chaos Charlize remembered from Isada's story, when everything had moved too slowly, when bureaucracy had buried a child's future beneath paperwork and silence. Charlize sat back in her chair, absorbing the weight of what she was reading. Miriam and her team hadn't waited. They hadn't needed to. Over the past 3 years, with quiet funding from Charlize's foundation and logistical training from a grassroots West African medical NGO, the women of Garam Garam had built something most outsiders had never even thought possible: a fully community-led epidemic response system. It wasn't flashy, no helicopters, no crisis PR teams, no CNN cameras filming dramatic rescues, but it worked. Supplies that had once sat stalled in European warehouses now waited, securely stored in shaded village depots, protected from dust and rot, inventoried monthly by women like Miriam, who knew exactly how much they needed and when. The trained volunteers weren't foreign experts flown in for a week. They were locals, teachers, youth leaders, mothers, former patients. People who knew the terrain, who could reach the most remote compounds on foot if necessary. The response time? Hours, not days. A makeshift isolation zone had already been set up by mid-afternoon. Clean water distribution points activated. Households with symptoms received visits before nightfall. Mobile radios crackled with coordinated updates from outposts across the district. By the time Charlize replied, "Anything you need," the answer came within minutes. "Just your prayers, and maybe your pride." Charlize stared at that last line, her throat tight. She wasn't crying, not quite, but her chest felt heavy with something that wasn't sadness. It was reverence. For the first time in her entire career as an activist, she felt what true, meaningful partnership looked like: invisible, unglamorous, effective. She had played no lead role here. Her name didn't appear on any plaque. No one had flown her in to cut a ribbon, but lives were being saved, not because of her presence, but because of her decision years ago to step back, to fund, to trust. The cholera outbreak in Garam Garam would be contained within 5 days. 3 lives were lost, 3 too many, but compared to past epidemics, it was a miracle. And this time, it wasn't charity that made the difference. It was preparation, it was dignity, it was local knowledge. It was a mother who once lost her daughter and swore no one else should. And it was working. The outbreak lasted exactly 5 days. 3 confirmed deaths. Not a statistic to be celebrated, but for Garam Garam, where past epidemics had claimed dozens of lives, it was as close to a miracle as anyone dared to hope for. In previous years, cholera swept through villages like a silent fire, too fast for help to arrive, too cruel in its efficiency. Entire families lost within a week, funerals with no time for grief, but not this time. This time, the system worked. The supplies were already in place: oral rehydration salts, water purification tablets, gloves, soap. The protocols had already been rehearsed by community health workers. The most vulnerable households were mapped in advance. Every hour counted, and not one was wasted on approvals or red tape. The clinics didn't wait for outside instruction. They moved, and the world barely noticed. There were no viral headlines, no Crisis in Africa banners running across news tickers, no telethons, no social media challenges. The story didn't fit the usual narrative. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tragic enough to trend. It was efficient. It was local. It was led by the very people who had once been painted as helpless. But those on the ground knew what had just happened. They knew that this quiet success had been earned, not gifted. They knew that it had come from years of preparation, of small wins stacked silently on top of each other. From Miriam's meticulous notebooks, from teenage volunteers who learned to administer IV drips under mango trees, From countless community meetings where voices were heard and solutions designed not in New York, but in Namantenga and Udalan. And somewhere, miles away in Geneva, Charlize read the final update. Outbreak contained. No new cases. Local government stepping in to support ongoing surveillance. She exhaled slowly and didn't reply right away. Instead, she sat in stillness, letting the gravity of it sink in. This wasn't her story to finish. It never had been. No cameras had arrived, no celebrity photo ops staged. Just healing. Quiet, competent, community-powered healing. And in that silence, something even more powerful than applause emerged. Dignity, ownership. Proof that the narrative could be rewritten, not with slogans, but with systems that worked when no one was watching. The kind of revolution that doesn't need recognition, just results. The morning after the final report came through, Charlize stood by her hotel window in Geneva, phone in hand, watching the fog drift over Lake Léman. The city moved quietly below her, too distant, too polished to reflect what had just unfolded in Garam Garam. She dialed the number she now knew by heart. It didn't take long for him to answer. "President Traoré," she began softly, "I just wanted you to know." It worked. The network held. The outbreak, 3 deaths. Only 3. There was a pause, deep and steady on the other end. Then his voice, calm as ever. "I know. I spoke to Miriam yesterday." Charlize smiled. "We helped. We really helped this time." Another pause. Then came the gentle correction. "No, Miss Theron," Traoré said. "They helped themselves. You helped create space. We didn't get in their way. That was enough." His words landed like a stone in a still pond, rippling, settling, reshaping the reflection. Charlize didn't argue. She simply nodded even though he couldn't see her. Her smile was quiet, thoughtful, not of triumph, but of understanding. Pride, she realized, didn't have to come from being the hero. It could come from watching others lead, knowing you had trusted them enough to succeed. For the first time in her life, she felt the warmth of impact without the heat of spotlight. She looked back out at the lake, the fog thinning, the world slowly waking. And in her chest, a calm pride rose. Not pride in herself, but in them. In Miriam. In the volunteers. In a little girl's village that now saved lives, not waited for rescue. Sometimes the best thing you can do is step back. And believe. Charlize no longer seeks the spotlight. She declines most speaking engagements unless they center African voices. Instead, she uses her platform to elevate leaders, thinkers, and creators from the communities she once tried to help. She develops a personal code for responsible activism, quiet, clear, and rooted in humility. Listen before you speak. Support before you lead. Learn before you assume. And never center yourself in someone else's struggle. She starts mentoring other celebrities who want to do better. Some resist, others begin to shift. She reminds them, impact isn't measured by attention, it's measured by dignity. The world starts to notice the difference. One afternoon, an envelope arrives, handwritten, postmarked from Burkina Faso. It's from a student group at the University of Ouagadougou. They invite Charlize to speak, not about Africa, but about her own journey of unlearning. At first, she hesitates. What could I possibly tell them, she wonders. She calls President Traoré. His response is simple. They don't want you to speak for Africa. They want you to speak about what happens when someone finally listens. So she says yes. On stage at the university, Charlize begins quietly. I once called a president to say thank you. Instead, he taught me to listen. She tells Isada's story, not as a tragic tale, but as a turning point. Students don't cry. They nod, understanding what it means to lose someone to systems that fail. Then a young woman in the back stands. Thank you for what you stopped doing. Silence falls. Not heavy, but profound. The screen fades to a mural in Garam Garam. Isata's smile, surrounded by math equations. Below it, the words, don't cry for our children. Stand where they stood, learn what they knew, then speak. A legacy is born, not of charity, but of shared humanity. This story is a powerful reminder that true change doesn't begin with giving, it begins with listening. Charlize Theron's transformation shows us that even with the best intentions, we can cause harm if we don't truly understand the people we're trying to help. What began as a simple thank you call became a journey of humility, learning, and partnership. It challenges us to rethink the way we view charity, leadership, and impact. Maybe the most powerful thing we can do is step back and make space for others to lead. Have you ever realized you were helping the wrong way? What did you learn from it? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.